Hello, I am Peter Litchfield, and it is my special pleasure, once again, to speak to you on the subject of breathing on behalf of the Shambhala Mountain Center and the Graduate School of Breathing Sciences. This video is the third video of a series of 3 on the subject of dysfunctional breathing habits, with a special focus on overbreathing and its effects. There will be a 4th video very shortly, where I will answer your questions regarding the previous materials that I have presented. Please send your questions by email to Shambhala Mountain Center. I look forward to answering them. I am the president of the Graduate School of Breathing Sciences. We are a faculty of 16 physiologists, physicians, and psychologists. Together as a team, we offer a webinar-based Masters of Science degree in Applied Breathing Sciences for healthcare practitioners, human service professionals, performance consultants, educators, and many others. Should you be interested, please contact us. I'd like to talk about my previous video for a few minutes before starting into the next subject. Here is the lesson that I was trying to pass on to you in my second video. Most of us do not think of breathing as behavior. We think of breathing as a reflex or as physiology we manipulate to self-regulate. As a result, we rarely think of breathing habits, and our focus becomes technique-oriented. This is a big, big mistake. Thinking of breathing as behavior changes this focus. Breathing is regulated by the same principles of learning that regulate any other behavior. Self-defeating breathing habits or dysfunctional habits are very quickly and easily learned, usually unconsciously. Like most habits. Failure to identify breathing habits and their effects means mistakenly attributing their consequences to other causes. So rather than focusing on disengaging these dysfunctional habits, that is, addressing the actual causes of these symptoms and deficits, focus centers on band-aid treatment of symptoms, like the use of psychiatric drugs, as in the case that I described to you last time. In essence, we become victims of our own habits, rather than active players in their solutions. That's the lesson of the last video. Now here's a little bit more about that last video. We looked at breathing habits and how or why they become dysfunctional. Basically, a habit is dysfunctional if it compromises your health and or your performance. And when these habits compromise respiration, this is really a huge price to pay, as you've seen in the past 2 videos when we've discussed the effects of hypocapnia. Now, habit analysis is about identifying the elements of the habit. Specifically, what is the bad habit? What are the behaviors that you're engaging in that's creating the problem? What are the triggers that are engaging the habit? Like we saw in the case I presented to you last time, eating was the trigger. In this case, for the athlete who I talked to you about last time. Or in another example I gave you of the gold medalist ice dancer in the Canadian Olympics, where getting on the ice and skating was the trigger for the dysfunctional behavior. There are many, many kinds of triggers. And then we have to identify the effects that are associated with these dysfunctional habits. We just don't assume that because we identified a dysfunctional habit, therefore all the symptoms that we're looking at are a result of that habit. You can never make that assumption. You must pinpoint the effects of the dysfunctional habit or the symptoms that are being exacerbated by that habit. You have to identify the motivation that's involved in maintaining that habit. And what are the payoffs? What are the reinforcements for keeping that habit in place? What's the history of the habit? How did the habit evolve? In looking at compromised respiration as a function of dysfunctional breathing, we use a capnograph, an educational capnograph, so we can see when in fact you're overbreathing or underbreathing, which as I've pointed out is very rare. You don't come across that very often. In fact, I never have in my whole career because I don't work with people who have compromised physical conditions very often. But we can identify a dysfunctional habit with a capnograph, and we can identify the triggers that are connected with that habit. And I went through a case with you last time in some detail. And then we went into what can you do if you suspect that you're suffering with a dysfunctional habit during times of stress. What can you do? And I mentioned a couple of things. One of them had to do with the transition time. Very often, as people start to breathe out, they start to get a little apprehension about the next breath. And this is usually completely unconscious. So as you breathe out, you can look for that little bit of discomfort at the end of the breath. And then you can desensitize yourself to that. And you can make the transition time between the exhale and inhale something valuable to you, a time of solitude, a time to meditate, in a sense, for a brief time. And I talked to you about, in essence, how you could desensitize yourself so that that little bit of apprehension might not be there, so that it would essentially remove the motivation for the taking over of the behavior. Rather than allowing the breath, you've taken over the breath. If you can get rid of the motivation for taking the breath and the payoff for taking the breath, chances are it won't happen anymore. And that's really what that was about. Then the second technique I talked about had to do with inhalation, about minimizing the breath, to see how quiet you could make the breath so that your preference for taking large breaths changes to taking the more minimal breaths, the smaller breaths, where there's less effort involved and where you can see, in essence, that it takes very little to get enough air. It's all about identifying the reflex between the exhale and the inhale and learning to trust it, learning to trust that reflex. That's what the two techniques were about that we talked about last time. Now we're going to talk about intuitive learning as a way of overcoming a dysfunctional habit and as a way of breathing in general versus prescriptive control that so many of us get involved in. So when we think about breathing, as I've mentioned just a little bit earlier, we often think of prescriptive interventions as a way of dealing with our daily challenges. We have breathing interventions that we do to deal with stress, to relax, and so on. And they can be very effective. But what we don't tend to realize is that there are breathing habits that can very specifically regulate the onset and offset of all kinds of symptoms and deficits during times of challenge in our lives. And what we need to do is to unlearn these habits and replace them with new ones, habits that are aligned with the respiratory reflex regulated breathing. We don't want to get in the way of those reflexes. So it means identifying the habit, its effects, its triggers, its motivation, its reinforcement, its history, as we've described. And the solutions focus on intuitive learning, as we will see, rather than on prescriptive control techniques, although they can be very useful in times of crisis. So I like to describe prescriptive breathing as outside in because it's deliberate or intentional breathing. It's about doing breathing that's expected to have positive outcomes. And it is about awareness development, which is good, and skill acquisition, like learning to diaphragmatically breathe if you don't do it. It normally involves a regimen, a protocol, a practice of some kind that you learn. And examples would be relaxation training or an intervention to block a crisis. But these kinds of breathing, these prescriptive forms of breathing, have major limitations. They don't address the breathing habits, except by accident. They don't address the causes. And this is a problem, of course. Although they can address these things by accident. For example, if you teach someone to breathe slowly, you may, in the final analysis, reduce your fear that occurs during the transition, or you may end up removing the fear that you had before during that transition, and then give credit to the slow breathing you did, rather than to really what was going on, which was a kind of emotional learning that occurred during those long transition times. Now here's an example of how obviously prescriptive breathing isn't going to work, just to make the point. Many people who suffer with trauma learn overbreathing habits. And these habits are often very chronic in nature. That is, they overbreathe most of the time. Overbreathing allows them to dissociate, to disconnect with memories they don't like, and to avoid feelings that they don't want to have. So overbreathing becomes a major coping technique. And there's major motivation and a major payoff for doing it. Obviously, teaching someone to breathe diaphragmatically or to breathe slowly or whatever it is that you might want to teach them isn't going to work if that's what their habit is all about. The habit has to be addressed head on and its elements sorted out. Now here's an example, a really interesting, fun kind of an example. This is a professional counselor I met many years ago who was suffering with hypertension, and he'd been suffering with hypertension for more than 10 years. And interestingly, he'd been doing yoga for the same period of time. And he taught prescriptive breathing to his patients for relaxation. He considered himself an expert on the subject of breathing, in fact. And he monitored his blood pressure daily and found no change in his blood pressure during all those years. And he concluded that his yoga practice simply wasn't effective. It simply was unable to contribute meaningfully to his condition. Now, I hooked him up to a capnograph, and I could see that he was badly overbreathing. But when I pointed it out to him, he denied that this could be true because he, from his perspective, was an expert in breathing, had been doing yoga all those years, and had lots of patients that he was teaching breathing to, and there's no way that he could be engaging in such self-defeating, self-destructive breathing behavior. But I showed him the graph. I showed him his live CO2 trace, as you've seen in some previous slides, and he could see that his CO2 level was low, and in fact he was overbreathing severely. He was indeed really confused by this. He just couldn't understand how this could be true. I took his blood pressure at the time, and it was high, as usual, in the high 90s. So I asked him to do his yoga. And within 5 to 8 minutes, something like that, his carbon dioxide rose to within normal limits. And I took his blood pressure during that time, and it was in the low 70s. There was a radical drop in blood pressure. However, as soon as he stopped doing his yoga, he resumed his overbreathing habit, and his carbon dioxide level dropped, and his blood pressure returned to its usual levels. In the matter of maybe 30 to 60 seconds, his blood pressure was right back up in the 90s. He couldn't understand the normal blood pressure reading we obtain. He just couldn't see how his blood pressure could be in the 70s, his diastolic pressure, when in fact he'd been measuring his blood pressure for years and had never seen it below the 90s. He just couldn't get it. Well, the fact is he always checked his blood pressure after his yoga sessions rather than during the yoga sessions. So when he finished doing a yoga session, he would hook himself up to a blood pressure device to see what his blood pressure was, and it was always in the 90s. If he had measured the blood pressure during the time he had been doing his yoga, he would have found that his blood pressure was actually in the 70s and that the yoga that he was doing was effective. It's just that when he discontinued it, the old habit reinstated itself. In essence, by doing his yogic practice, he wasn't addressing his overbreathing habit. So the habit would constantly reinstate itself as soon as he was finished doing his practice that he had learned over the years and been doing for some 10 years. In essence, the triggers weren't identified, the motivation wasn't identified, the reinforcement wasn't identified, the whole history of the problem had never been identified. So his practice was prescriptive. And it did, in fact, lower his blood pressure, only briefly. And it was, of course, unknown to him because he never looked at his blood pressure when he was doing the yoga. By the time he took his blood pressure, the chronic habit had always reinstated itself and continued to trigger and perpetuate his hypertension. So his original conclusion was actually right. His prescriptive breathing was not effective. His breathing technique addressed his symptoms but not the causes. So while he was doing the yoga, he was addressing the symptoms, although he didn't know it. He was addressing them successfully. But as soon as he stopped doing that, then it reinstated itself because the causes had never been addressed. Now the solution was really an intuitive breathing solution. And when you look at breathing as behavior, it becomes kind of obvious. Otherwise, it's not. The solution was a physiological reconfiguration, which meant unlearning an old habit and replacing it with a new one aligned with the respiratory reflex regulation. Now, if you sign up for the workshop that's coming up, you're going to learn about how to do this. Now, we say the way we like to think of it is that intuitive breathing is inside-out breathing based on self-exploration. He, in essence, changed his unconscious breathing style. He didn't have to think about it anymore. He automatically breathed in the right way. He changed his breathing personality. So it's about allowing the breathing. And so whether you're stressed or relaxed, whether you're bored or excited, whether you're tired or you're rested, whether you're frightened or excited, you're asleep, you're sleepy or you feel awake, breathing was designed in a way to support respiration. Because the respiratory reflexes don't have anything to do with whether you're excited or frightened or asleep or awake or fatigued or rested or bored or whatever it is. They're responsive to the CO2 levels, the oxygen levels, and the pH levels of the different body fluids. Okay? So the mechanics of breathing are variable, and they change constantly as a function of what we're doing. Like right now, for example, my breathing is acrobatic as I try to communicate with you, as I try to speak to you. And I'm engaged in speaking English, and I'm putting certain inflections on words, and I'm doing all kinds of things to emphasize points, and I'm constantly changing my breathing. I'm breathing fast, I'm breathing slow, I'm breathing dysrhythmically, all kinds of things I'm doing, but my CO2 levels should be stable. They should be more or less stable at all times. So my mechanics need to work around the chemistry of my breath. So in essence, I've got to allow those reflexes to operate even though I'm using my breath for other things. So how can you learn new habits? I'm going to talk about one way that you might be able to do this. It's something called negative practice. Most bad habits are not initially under your control. Like if you're a chest breather, most people will breathe in the chest. If you ask them to breathe in the diaphragm, they can't do it. Okay? They just can't disengage their dysfunctional habit. But if the person lies down, okay, typically what will happen is they'll find themselves breathing diaphragmatically when they lie down. Now, when you ask them when they're lying down, like if you're a chest breather, you can lie down and try this. You lie down, and then you can find yourself breathing diaphragmatically, and you try to breathe in your chest. And very often you can't. Or it's a real challenge to get into your chest, even though you do that kind of breathing all day long. Or you do it in times of stress. Okay? So what negative practice is about is learning to engage the bad habit. That you own the bad habit. It becomes your bad habit. So it's not something that just happens to you, but you can do it on command. You can breathe with your chest at any time you want. You know exactly how to do it. And then you can breathe in your diaphragm, and then breathe in your chest, and breathe in your diaphragm. So you practice your bad habit. So if you find yourself doing it, you can stop it because you know how you did it. Okay, so you become an expert in your bad habit. You take ownership of it. So you can give up that ownership. But unless you have the ownership, you really can't give it up. So it's about becoming an expert on your bad habit. So here, I have it written out for you here. It says, make diaphragmatic breathing your habit rather than chest breathing when you encounter life challenges. Take ownership of your chest breathing habit. So you switch back and forth between the two kinds of breathing, and you make it easy to do either one, and you focus on what you like and you dislike about each one. In a lot of people, they'll find they don't like diaphragmatic breathing at all, and they like the chest breathing for all kinds of reasons. So the idea is to develop a new preference for breathing in the diaphragm. Unless you can create a preference for breathing in the diaphragm over breathing in the chest, you're not going to do it. Once you develop that preference, then you challenge yourself. Like, how are you breathing now while on the telephone? How do you breathe while you're working on your computer? How do you breathe while you're presenting at a meeting? If you find yourself chest breathing, you can revert right into diaphragmatic breathing as a function of the negative practice you've learned. And the idea is to develop a preference, an unconscious preference for the diaphragmatic breathing by practicing it in the way I have described here. So that when you're on the phone and you find yourself breathing in the chest, you just automatically go into the diaphragm without even thinking about it. And it becomes the dominant habit, and it replaces the chest breathing habit. So, the fourth video will be about answering your questions based on our video series. This is a little description of the 3 videos that we've completed. Please contact Shambhala Center with your questions. Please send them an email, and I'll try to answer those questions in the next video. How can you learn new breathing habits? Here are some actions you can take. Come to the workshop that we're doing in January and February, or attach the checklist that will be in the email from Shambhala and send it to this email here, and we'll contact you for a consultation session. If you're interested in getting involved in breathing as a part of your work as a healthcare professional, you're interested in really becoming an expert in breathing sciences, think about enrolling in our MS degree program. If you're interested, please contact me directly at the email I'm showing here, or visit us at our website, breathingsciences.bp.edu. I hope to see you in our workshop or to hear from you some other time. Thank you so much for listening.